The autumn wind swept across the vast Wyoming plains, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust that had become the signature of the frontier. The year was 1887, and the small town of Redemption Creek sat like a weathered scar on the landscape, its wooden buildings huddled together against the endless expanse of prairie grass and distant mountains. Main Street was little more than a dirt road, flanked by the saloon, the general store, and the auction house. 3 pillars of civilization in this harsh land where men carved out lives from stone and sand. Jacob Harlow stood on the porch of the Silver Dollar Saloon, his boots propped against the railing as he surveyed his domain. At 35, he was one of the wealthiest ranchers in the territory, owner of the sprawling Double H Ranch that stretched for miles beyond the horizon. His weathered face bore the marks of a man who had fought the land and won. With deep-set gray eyes that missed nothing and a jaw that suggested stubbornness was bred into his bones. Men tipped their hats when they passed him on the street, acknowledging both his success and the power it brought. Women, however, kept their distance, sensing something hard and unyielding beneath his handsome exterior. "Another auction today," muttered Tom Brennan, Jacob's foreman and drinking companion, as he joined him on the porch. "Heard there's a new widow in the mix." Jacob took a long draw from his whiskey. The autumn auctions had become a grim tradition in Redemption Creek, a marketplace where desperate women, widowed or abandoned, essentially sold themselves to the highest bidder in exchange for protection and sustenance. It was a practice that turned his stomach, though he'd never voiced such sentiments aloud. In the West, pragmatism trumped sentiment every time. "Who is she?" Jacob asked, more out of habit than interest. "Nobody knows much," Tom replied, spitting tobacco juice into the street. "Came in on yesterday's stage, all wrapped up in black like a crow. Won't show her face to nobody. Folk are calling her the Mystery Widow." Inside the saloon, Jacob could hear the crude laughter of men already placing bets on who would win which woman. The auction wouldn't start for another hour, but already the town was buzzing with the perverse excitement that accompanied these events. Jacob had never participated. He had no need for a wife, mysterious or otherwise. His ranch ran like clockwork. His bed was never cold when he didn't want it to be, and complications were something he actively avoided. "Strange thing, though," Tom continued, lowering his voice. "Mary at the boarding house says she heard the woman crying in her room last night. Not just regular crying, mind you, but the kind that comes from somewhere deep, like an animal in pain." Jacob shifted uncomfortably. He'd heard that sound before, in the war, when men realized they were dying far from home. He pushed the memory away and drained his glass. "Come on, boys," a voice boomed from across the street. Judge Samuel Morrison, the self-appointed auctioneer and town magistrate, was already setting up his platform. "Let's get this blessed event started. We've got 5 lovely ladies looking for good Christian homes." The crowd began to gather, men pushing and shoving for better positions. Jacob remained on the porch, watching with detached interest as the first women were brought out. He knew them all. Sarah Mills, whose husband had died in a mining accident. Betty Donovan, abandoned with 3 children when her husband went searching for gold and never returned. Young Annie Peterson, barely 18 and already worn down by frontier life. Then she appeared. The Mystery Widow, as Tom had called her, walked onto the platform with a bearing that immediately set her apart from the others. While the other women hunched their shoulders against the crowd's scrutiny, she stood straight, wrapped in a black cloak that covered her from head to toe. A heavy veil obscured her face completely, and black gloves covered her hands. She moved with an odd grace, as if she were floating rather than walking. And when she took her place on the platform, she stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from midnight. The crowd fell silent. Even in a town accustomed to hard luck stories, there was something unsettling about this figure of complete concealment. "Now, gentlemen," Judge Morrison began, his usual bluster somewhat diminished. "We have here a widow who prefers to maintain her privacy. She's educated, can read and write, and knows her way around a household. She's asked me not to share her name until..." until arrangements are made. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "What's she hiding?" someone called out. "Maybe she's diseased," another suggested. "Or ugly as sin under all that black." Jacob found himself stepping down from the porch, drawn by something he couldn't name. As he pushed through the crowd, he caught snippets of conversation. "I heard she came from back east. Someone said she was asking about the old Hendricks place, the one that burned down, probably running from something shameful." When he reached the front of the crowd, Jacob looked up at the woman in black. For a moment, he could have sworn she was looking directly at him, though he couldn't see her eyes through the veil. There was something in her posture, proud yet fragile, like a thoroughbred that had been ridden too hard but refused to break. "Well, gentlemen," Judge Morrison called out, "shall we start the bidding at $20? Silence. No one wanted to risk their money on an unknown quantity. $10? The judge tried again, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. Still nothing. The woman on the platform remained motionless, but Jacob noticed her gloved hands clench slightly at her sides. "Come now. Surely someone—" "Hey, Harlow," a voice called from the saloon. Buck Watson, a fellow rancher known more for his gambling than his cattle, swaggered into view. "I've got a proposition for you." Jacob turned, already disliking where this was headed. Buck was flanked by two other men, all of them grinning with the peculiar malice of those about to cause trouble. "I'll bet you $100 you can't get that crow to show what's under all them feathers," Buck declared loudly, gesturing toward the woman on the platform. "Hell, I'll make it $200 if you can bet her by sunrise." The crowd erupted in laughter and catcalls. On the platform, the woman in black took a small step backward, her first sign of distress. "You're drunk, Watson," Jacob said coldly. "Maybe so, but my money's good. Unless the great Jacob Harlow is afraid of a little mystery." Buck's grin widened. "Or maybe you've lost your touch with the ladies." Jacob felt the familiar burn of pride in his chest. He'd built his reputation on never backing down from a challenge, whether it was breaking horses, negotiating cattle prices, or facing down claim jumpers. The rational part of his mind told him to walk away, but the crowd was watching now, waiting to see if the mighty Jacob Harlow could be faced down by Buck Watson of all people. "Make it $300, he heard himself say. "And you've got a bet." Buck's eyes gleamed with triumph. "Done, boys, you heard him." Before he could reconsider, Jacob turned to Judge Morrison. $50 for the woman in black." The judge's eyes widened. $50, going once, going twice." $75. Jacob interrupted, his eyes never leaving the veiled figure. "And that's my final offer." "Sold." Morrison's gavel came down with unseemly haste. As the crowd dispersed, laughing and already spreading word of the wager, Jacob approached the platform. The woman hadn't moved, standing there like she'd been frozen in place. "Ma'am," he said quietly, offering his hand to help her down. "If you'll come with me." For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then, slowly, she placed her gloved hand in his. Through the fabric, he could feel her trembling. "My name is Clara," she whispered, her voice barely audible through the veil. "Clara Thornton." Jacob helped her into his wagon, intensely aware of the eyes watching them from every window and doorway as they drove away from town toward his ranch. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made either the best or the worst decision of his life. Beside him, Clara Thornton sat in perfect silence, a mystery wrapped in black, carrying secrets he was now bound to discover. The Wyoming sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like fire. Jacob gripped the reins tighter, pushing away the uncomfortable thought that he'd just purchased a human being on a bet. In the distance, his ranch sprawled across the prairie, and he found himself wondering what dawn would bring, and whether either of them would be the same when it came. The auction house fell into a tense silence as Judge Morrison raised his gavel, preparing to seal Clara Thornton's fate. Jacob stood at the front of the crowd, his jaw set with determination. aware that every eye in Redemption Creek was upon him. The wager with Buck Watson hung in the air like gun smoke, turning what should have been a simple transaction into a spectacle. $75 from Mr. Harlow, Morrison announced, his voice carrying across the square. Do I hear 80? The crowd shifted restlessly. Most men had come prepared to bid $20 or $30 at most. 75 was a small fortune, enough to buy several good horses or a modest homestead. But this wasn't about value anymore. It was about pride, speculation, and the dark entertainment of seeing what lay beneath Clara's veils. That's too rich for my blood, muttered Dan Cooper, the blacksmith, stepping back from the platform. Mine too, agreed several others, though their eyes remained fixed on the mysterious figure in black. Clara stood perfectly still throughout the proceedings, her posture rigid as a cemetery statue. Only the slight movement of fabric as she breathed betrayed that a living woman stood beneath all that black cloth. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Jacob wondered how she could bear the heat wrapped in such heavy garments. 75 going once, Morrison called out, mopping his brow with a yellowed handkerchief. Going twice. $100. A new voice rang out. The crowd parted as Ezra Blackwood pushed his way forward. The owner of the largest mercantile in 3 counties, Blackwood was known for his shrewd business sense and his collection of housekeepers, young women who worked in his mansion under circumstances that polite society preferred not to examine too closely. Jacob's hands clenched into fists. The thought of Clara in Blackwood's hands sent an unexpected surge of protectiveness through him. He told himself it was just about the bet, about not losing face in front of the town. 125, Jacob countered, his voice steady. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. 150. 200. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. $200 was more than most men saw in a year. Buck Watson whooped with delight from his position near the saloon, already calculating his potential winnings. Blackwood hesitated, his merchant's mind clearly weighing the investment against the unknown return. After a long moment, he shook his head and stepped back. She's all yours, Harlow. Hope she's worth it. $200, Morrison's voice cracked with excitement. Sold to Mr. Jacob Harlow. The gavel came down with finality, and the crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers, laughter, and speculative whispers. Jacob climbed the platform steps, trying to ignore the weight of what he'd just done. As he approached Clara, he noticed her hands were trembling more visibly now, clutched together in front of her black dress. Ma'am, he said quietly, pitching his voice so only she could hear, we need to go. Clara nodded once, a barely perceptible movement beneath her veils. When Jacob offered his arm, she hesitated before taking it. Through the fabric of her glove and his shirt sleeve, he could feel how thin her arm was, how fragile. They descended the platform together, running a gauntlet of staring faces and crude comments. Remember, Harlow, Buck called out. Sunrise tomorrow. I'll be checking. Jacob helped Clara into his wagon, noting how she gathered her skirts carefully, avoiding any display of ankle that might fuel further speculation. He climbed up beside her and took the reins, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the town square. As they rolled down Main Street, Clara finally spoke, her voice muffled by the veil but carrying a surprising note of steel. What was the wager? Jacob's hands tightened on the reins. He'd hoped she hadn't heard, though he should have known better. News traveled fast in a small town, especially news as salacious as this. It's not important, he said gruffly. $200 suggests otherwise. Her head turned slightly toward him. I have a right to know what you've purchased. The directness of her words surprised him. Most women in her position would have been too frightened or grateful to question their benefactor. But then again, most women didn't hide behind veils and mysteries. Buck Watson bet me I couldn't. Jacob paused, searching for delicate phrasing. That I couldn't convince you to remove your veil and become my wife in truth before sunrise. Clara was silent for so long that Jacob wondered if she'd fainted. Then she laughed, a short, bitter sound that held no humor. How disappointing for Mr. Watson. He's going to lose his money. Listen, ma'am, I don't expect— You paid $200. Clara interrupted. You made a wager in front of the entire town. Your reputation is at stake. I understand the situation perfectly. Mr. Harlow. They rode in uncomfortable silence after that, the wagon wheels creaking over the rutted road that led out of town. The Double H Ranch lay 5 miles from Redemption Creek, far enough for privacy but close enough for convenience. As they traveled, Jacob found himself stealing glances at his mysterious passenger. She sat with perfect posture despite the wagon's jolting, her gloved hands folded in her lap. The black veil was actually 2 layers. He realized, a heavier outer covering and a finer mesh beneath. Even in full sunlight, he could discern nothing of her features. Only the way she turned her head to track a hawk's flight or the slight tilt when she listened to the prairie sounds suggested a living woman beneath the mourning garb. "How long have you been widowed?" he asked, trying to break the oppressive silence. 14 months, she replied after a pause. My husband and son died in a fire. The flat delivery of those words carried more pain than any sob could have conveyed. Jacob thought of Tom's words about animal sounds in the night and felt an unexpected twist in his chest. "I'm sorry for your loss. Are you?" Clara's voice held genuine curiosity. "Or are you simply saying what's expected?" Jacob considered this. "Both, I suppose. It's what's expected. But I also mean it." "I lost my brother in the war. I know something about grief." Clara turned toward him more fully, as if reassessing. "Which side?" "Union. You." "My husband fought for Virginia. He came home missing an arm but alive. He used to say that was God's joke, surviving Antietam only to die from a knocked-over lantern." They crested a rise, and the Double H spread out before them. The main house stood 2 stories tall, built from local timber and stone, with a wraparound porch that Jacob had added the previous year. Behind it lay the bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings, all arranged with military precision. Cattle dotted the nearby pastures, and horses grazed in the home paddock. "It's impressive," Clara observed. "It's taken 10 years to build," Jacob replied, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "Started with nothing but a claim and a few mangy steers. And now you can afford to pay $200 for a widow at auction." The bitter edge had returned to her voice. "You must be very proud." Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house, irritation flaring. "Would you prefer I'd let Blackwood have you? Or maybe no one at all? You could be sleeping in the street tonight instead of in your bed." Clara finished quietly. "Yes, Mr. Harlow. I'm aware of my good fortune." She climbed down from the wagon before he could assist her, moving with that same ethereal grace he'd noticed on the platform. Maria, his Mexican housekeeper, appeared on the porch, her weathered face creased with curiosity and concern. "Maria, this is Mrs. Thornton," Jacob said, reverting to formality. "She'll be staying with us. Please prepare the blue room." Maria's eyebrows rose slightly. The blue room was the best guest chamber, usually reserved for visiting cattle buyers or Jacob's rare family visits. "Si, Senor Harlow." "Will the Senora be joining you for dinner?" Jacob looked at Clara, who stood apart like a black pillar against the golden evening light. "Mrs. Thornton? I would prefer a tray in my room, if that's acceptable." She turned to Maria. "I apologize for any inconvenience." "Is no trouble, Senora," Maria assured her, though her eyes darted questioningly to Jacob. As Maria led Clara inside, Jacob unhitched the horses, his mind churning. What had seemed like a simple matter of pride in town now felt complicated and unseemly. The woman, Clara, was clearly educated, well-spoken, and carrying grief like a physical burden. She wasn't some saloon girl who might laugh off a crude wager. She was a widow who'd lost everything and been reduced to selling herself for survival. He rubbed the horses down with more force than necessary, trying to ignore the voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like his late mother's, expressing disappointment in the man he'd become. By the time he finished, full darkness had settled over the ranch, and lights glowed warmly from the house windows. Inside, he found Maria in the kitchen, preparing a dinner tray with her usual efficiency. "The Senora. She is very sad," Maria said without preamble. "Why she hide her face?" "I don't know," Jacob admitted, pouring himself a generous whiskey from the sideboard. "She lost her family in a fire." Maria crossed herself. "Ah, poor woman. Fire is very bad. My cousin, she have scars from fire. Never show her face after." Jacob's hand stilled on his glass. Scars. He hadn't considered that possibility. It would explain the veils, the gloves, the complete coverage despite the heat. His stomach turned as he thought of Buck's crude wager, of the townspeople's speculation, of his own prideful acceptance of the bet. "Should I take the tray up?" he asked, suddenly feeling the need to see Clara again, to perhaps apologize or at least assure her that he wasn't the monster she seemed to think him. "No." Maria's tone brooked no argument. "She need time. You give her peace tonight." But peace wasn't in the cards. As Jacob sat down to his solitary dinner, he could hear footsteps pacing overhead, back and forth, like a caged animal testing the bars. The sound continued long after he'd finished eating, through his attempts to read, past the hour when the ranch hands turned in. Finally, near midnight, silence fell. Jacob climbed the stairs, pausing outside the blue room. No light showed beneath the door. No sound emerged. He raised his hand to knock, then thought better of it. What would he say? That he was sorry for purchasing her like livestock? That the bet didn't matter? Both were true, but words seemed inadequate. He retreated to his own room, but sleep eluded him. Through his window, he could see the stars scattered across the prairie sky like spilled diamonds. Somewhere in this house was a woman whose mystery had already begun to work its way under his skin. Dawn would come soon enough, bringing with it Buck Watson's expectations and the town's judgment. But as Jacob finally drifted towards sleep, it wasn't the bet that troubled his dreams. It was the sound of Clara Thornton's bitter laughter and the way she'd stood on that platform, alone, proud, and unbroken despite everything the world had taken from her. He'd paid $200 for a mystery, but he was beginning to suspect the true cost would be much higher. The grandfather clock in the hallway had just struck 2 when Jacob heard the soft knock on his bedroom door. He'd been lying awake, watching shadows dance across the ceiling, his mind refusing to quiet. At the sound, he sat up quickly, reaching for the oil lamp on his bedside table. "Come in," he called softly, expecting Maria with some household emergency. The door opened slowly, and Clara Thornton stood in the threshold, still wrapped in her black garments, but somehow seeming smaller, more vulnerable in the deep hours of the night. The lamplight flickered, casting wavering shadows that made her appear almost ghost-like. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor Jacob could see in her gloved hands. "But I thought it best we settle this matter without further delay." Jacob swung his legs out of bed, suddenly conscious of his state of undress, just trousers and an undershirt. He reached for his shirt hanging on the nearby chair. "Mrs. Thornton, you don't need to—" "Please!" She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "Let me speak before I lose my nerve." Jacob stilled, watching as she moved closer to the lamp's circle of light. Her fingers worked at the fastenings of her outer veil with practiced efficiency. The heavy black fabric fell away, revealing the finer mesh beneath. Through it, he could now make out the general shape of her features, though details remained hidden. 14 months ago, Clara began, her voice taking on a distant quality. "I lived in a small town in Kansas. My husband, Robert, ran a newspaper. He had strong opinions about the railroad companies and their treatment of local farmers. He wrote editorials, organized meetings. He believed words could change things." She paused, her hands moving to the pins that held the inner veil in place. He was wrong. Words just made him a target. Jacob remained silent, sensing that any interruption would shatter her fragile composure. He watched as she removed pin after pin, each small action seeming to require tremendous effort. They came at night, 4 men, hired by the railroad, though we could never prove it. They set fire to our house, to the newspaper office. Robert tried to get us out, but the smoke, Her voice caught. "Our son, Timothy, was only 6. He died in my arms while the town watched our life burn." The last pin came free, and Clara slowly lifted the veil. Jacob's breath caught in his throat, though not for the reason she clearly expected. Yes, there were scars, a brutal network of them running from her left temple across her scalp, where fire had claimed her hair and left only puckered, discolored skin. But what struck him was her face itself, even marked by tragedy. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, eyes the color of storm clouds that held depths of pain he could barely fathom. "Robert died 3 days later from his burns," she continued, her chin lifting as if daring him to look away. "I survived, though there were days I cursed God for that mercy. The railroad offered to buy our land for a fraction of its worth. When I refused, they made sure no one in town would employ me, help me, even speak to me. I became a walking reminder of what happened to those who opposed progress." She reached up with shaking hands and began removing what Jacob now realized was a wig, a poor quality one of coarse black hair. As it came away, the full extent of her injuries became clear. The fire had claimed most of her natural hair, leaving only patches of brown strands between areas of scarred scalp. It was shocking. Yes, but Jacob found himself thinking more about the pain she must have endured than any revulsion at her appearance. "So, you see, Mr. Harlow," Clara said, standing before him with a defiant tilt to her scarred head. "You've won your wager. The mystery widow stands revealed. Shall I send for Mr. Watson to collect his winnings, or will you require more proof of your victory?" The bitterness in her voice snapped Jacob from his stunned silence. "No," he said firmly. "No, that's not—" "Clara, please sit down." "I prefer to stand." "Then I'll stand too." Jacob rose, moving slowly as if approaching a spooked horse. "What happened to you was monstrous. Those men, the railroad company, your entire town, they were the monsters, not you." Clara laughed, that same bitter sound from the wagon. "Pretty words, Mr. Harlow. But we both know what I look like, what I am, a curiosity at best, a horror at worst. Tomorrow, when Buck Watson spreads the news, I'll be the talk of Redemption Creek, the burned widow who thought she could hide her shame. The only shame belongs to those who hurt you," Jacob said, surprised by the vehemence in his own voice. "And Buck Watson can go to hell." Clara's eyes widened slightly. "The wager was a fool's bet made by a prideful fool." Jacob interrupted. "I'll pay Watson his money and tell him I lost, that you maintained your privacy, as was your right. He won't believe you. The whole town will know you're lying to protect this." She gestured to her scars with a self-deprecating wave. Jacob moved closer, close enough to see the way her remaining eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks, the faint freckles across her nose that the fire hadn't touched. "Then let them know. But they'll also know that Jacob Harlow stands by his word, and my word is that you're under my protection. Anyone who has something to say about your appearance can say it to me first." Clara stared at him, searching his face as if looking for the trick, the cruel punchline to an elaborate joke. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that?" Jacob considered the question. Why indeed? Pride had driven him to make the bet, but something else entirely was driving him now. Perhaps it was the way she'd laughed about her husband's bitter joke, or how she'd spoken of her son, or simply the courage it had taken to stand before him and bear not just her scars, but her story. "Because you've survived worse than anything this town can dish out," he said finally. "And because I'm tired of being the kind of man who makes wagers on women's misfortune." Clara sank into the chair he'd originally offered, as if his words had cut the strings holding her upright. "I don't understand you, Mr. Harlow." "Jacob," he corrected gently. "And I'm not sure I understand myself right now, but I know I won't force you into anything. The blue room is yours for as long as you need it. We'll figure out the rest as we go. The town will expect, Buck Watson will expect. Let me handle Buck Watson." Jacob's voice hardened. He'd dealt with men like Buck before, men who found entertainment in others' humiliation. As for the town, well, they'll always find something to gossip about. Next week, it'll be someone else's scandal. Clara touched her scarred scalp self-consciously, then seemed to catch herself and lowered her hand. I should return to my room. This is highly improper. Propriety flew out the window the moment I bid on you at a public auction. Jacob said dryly, but yes, you should rest. Tomorrow will likely be eventful. Clara stood, reaching for her wig and veils. Jacob watched her preparing to hide herself again and felt an unexpected pang. You don't have to wear those here, at the ranch. I mean, if you don't want to. She paused, holding the wig in her hands like a dead thing. I've worn them so long, I'm not sure I remember how to exist without them. Maybe it's time to remember, Jacob suggested softly. Clara looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once, a small, uncertain movement. She left the veils on his chair and walked to the door, her bald head held high despite the visible tremor in her shoulders. Mr. Harlow, Jacob, she said, turning back. Whatever happens tomorrow, thank you for listening, for seeing me as more than just my scars. We all have scars, Jacob replied. Some are just more visible than others. After she left, Jacob sat in his chair staring at the black veils she'd left behind. The fabric was worn in places, carefully mended evidence of constant use and limited means. He thought about Clara's story, about a woman who'd lost everything to greed and violence, who'd been driven from her home for the crime of being married to a man with principles. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, answered by another. The prairie night was full of predators and prey, hunters and hunted. Clara had been prey for too long, Jacob decided. If Buck Watson or anyone else wanted to make sport of her, they'd find Jacob Harlow standing in their way. He extinguished the lamp and returned to bed, but sleep remained elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Clara's face, scarred but unbroken, beautiful in its defiance. He'd started this day as a man confident in his place in the world, secure in his reputation and power. But something had shifted in the lamplight of his bedroom, something fundamental that he couldn't yet name. The stars were beginning to fade when exhaustion finally claimed him. His last conscious thought was of the wig Clara had carried out like a burden she was still learning how to set down. Tomorrow, today, now, would bring its own challenges. Buck Watson would come collecting. The town would demand its entertainment. And Clara would have to decide whether to keep hiding or step into the light. But for now, in the pre-dawn quiet of the Double H Ranch, two damaged souls had found an unexpected moment of understanding. It wasn't love, not yet, perhaps not ever, but it was a beginning, fragile as new growth after a prairie fire, and just as determined to survive. The following weeks at the Double H Ranch developed a rhythm that surprised everyone, not least Jacob himself. Clara had indeed stopped wearing her veils around the ranch, though she kept her head covered with a simple bonnet when working outdoors. The ranch hands, after their initial shock, had adapted with the practical acceptance of men who'd seen their share of hardship. If Mr. Harlow's new woman had scars, well, that was between them and the Lord. Jacob watched from the porch as Clara worked in the vegetable garden she'd claimed behind the kitchen. The late morning sun highlighted the patchwork of scars and surviving hair on her uncovered head as she bent among the rows of struggling plants. Maria had protested that tending the garden was her job, but Clara had insisted she needed something to do with her hands, something to nurture after so much death. She's got away with them plants, Tom Brennan observed, joining Jacob on the porch. That patch hasn't produced decent vegetables in 3 years, but look at them tomatoes coming in. It was true, under Clara's care. The neglected garden had begun to flourish. She'd reorganized the rows, started a compost heap that had scandalized Maria until she saw the results, and somehow coaxed life from soil that had seemed exhausted. She knows what she's doing, Jacob agreed, unable to keep a note of pride from his voice. Tom shot him a knowing look, but wisely kept his observations to himself. The foreman had been there the morning Buck Watson came to collect his winnings, had seen Jacob pay the man off while maintaining that he'd lost the bet. That Mrs. Thornton had maintained her privacy, as was her right. Buck had left unsatisfied, but richer. And the story that spread through Redemption Creek was muddled enough that people weren't quite sure what to believe. "Drought's getting worse," Tom said, changing the subject to safer ground. "Lost 2 more head yesterday. Found 'em down by Miller's Creek, or what's left of it. Water's down to a trickle." Jacob frowned. His attention pulled from Clara to the more immediate concern of keeping his cattle alive. The autumn had been drier than usual, and winter was approaching with no sign of relief. Other ranchers were already selling off stock they couldn't water, flooding the market and driving prices down. "We'll move the herd to the north pasture," he decided. "The well there is still producing. Might have to dig a new one come spring if this keeps up." A commotion from the direction of the barn caught their attention. One of the younger hands, Pete Morrison, was backing away from something, his face pale. Clara had risen from her garden, shading her eyes to see what was happening. "Snake!" Pete shouted. "Rattler in the grain bin!" Jacob was moving before he'd consciously decided to. Tom, right behind him. Rattlesnakes were a constant danger on the ranch, especially in dry weather when they sought out the cool shadows of buildings. The grain bin was particularly dangerous. A man reaching in blindly could easily be bitten before he knew the snake was there. But Clara reached the barn first. Without hesitation, she grabbed a long-handled hoe from against the wall and approached the bin with calm purpose. "Mrs. Thornton, get back," Jacob called, but she was already in motion, with precise movements. Clara used the hoe to flip open the bin's lid fully, exposing the coiled rattlesnake within. The snake's rattle filled the air with its warning, but Clara didn't flinch. She waited, patient as a hunter, until the snake made its move. When it struck at the hoe, she pinned its head with one swift motion, then brought the blade down decisively. The entire action had taken less than 30 seconds. Clara stepped back, breathing slightly hard, the dead snake still twitching at the end of her tool. "Always check with a stick first," she said to Pete, who was staring at her with something approaching awe. Snakes like dark, cool places in weather like this. "Where did you learn that?" Jacob asked, impressed despite himself. Clara's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Kansas. Robert was useless with anything practical. Bless him. Someone had to keep the snakes out of the newspaper office." She disposed of the snake with the same practical efficiency, tossing it far from the buildings where it wouldn't attract scavengers. When she turned back, she seemed surprised to find everyone still watching her. "Don't you all have work to do?" she asked mildly. The hands scattered, but Jacob heard Pete telling the others, "Did you see that? Cool as winter water. She didn't even blink." "That was well done," Jacob said when they were alone. "Most women would have run screaming. Most women haven't had to fend for themselves." Clara replied, cleaning the hoe blade with a handful of straw. "After Robert died, there was no one else to handle such things. You learn or you starve, or you get bit and die. Simple as that." There was no self-pity in her tone, just matter-of-fact acceptance. Jacob found himself studying her face, noting how the sun had brought out freckles on the undamaged portions of her skin, how her gray eyes held flecks of blue in the bright light. "Will you ride with me this afternoon?" he asked impulsively. "I need to check the water situation at the north pasture, and you might as well see more of the ranch." Clara hesitated. "I haven't ridden since before, and I have no proper riding clothes." "Maria can alter something of mine," Jacob said, warming to the idea. "And we have a gentle mare who'll treat you kindly, unless you'd prefer not to." He saw the war in her face, the desire for normalcy, battling against fear of exposure, of judgment. Then her chin came up in that gesture he was learning meant she'd made a decision. "I'd like that," she said simply. 3 hours later, they rode out across the prairie, Clara sitting the mare with more skill than she'd claimed. She wore a modified pair of Jacob's trousers and one of his shirts, her scarred head covered by a wide-brimmed hat he'd found in storage. The clothes hung loose on her thin frame, but she seemed more at ease in them than in her widow's weeds. They rode in companionable silence at first, the only sounds the creak of leather and the steady clop of hooves on hard-packed earth. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, brown grass rippling like a dry ocean under the persistent wind. "It's so empty," Clara observed, but her tone suggested appreciation rather than fear. In Kansas, there were always farms, towns, something on the horizon. Here, it's just space. Does it bother you? No, it's honest. The land doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. She adjusted her hat as a stronger gust threatened to steal it. People are the ones who complicate things with their pretensions and cruelties. They created a rise, and Jacob pulled up his horse, Clara following suit. Below them, what should have been a thriving pasture showed the brutal effects of the drought. The grass was sparse and brown, the usually reliable creek reduced to a series of muddy pools. "It's worse than Tom said," Jacob muttered, calculating how long his wells could support the entire herd. "What will you do?" "Move the cattle, dig new wells, pray for rain." He turned his horse toward the creek bed. "Same thing ranchers always do, survive or go under." They dismounted near one of the remaining pools, letting the horses drink while they assessed the situation. Clara walked along the creek bed, her borrowed boots leaving prints in the cracked mud. In Kansas, before the railroad trouble started, Robert wrote about farmers using windmills to pump water from deep wells. She said thoughtfully, "The technology is improving. Might be worth considering." Jacob looked at her with renewed interest. "You read his articles?" "I edited them," Clara corrected. Robert had brilliant ideas but terrible spelling. I also kept the books, managed subscriptions, set type when our printer was drunk, which was often. She paused, a shadow crossing her face. "I love that life, the ink stains, the rush to get the paper out, the feeling that words could matter. Foolish. Really." "Not foolish," Jacob said firmly. "Dangerous, maybe, in the end, but not foolish. Taking a stand for something never is." Clara turned to face him fully, the afternoon sun harsh on her scars, but somehow unable to diminish her growing vitality. "Is that what you tell yourself about the auction? That you were taking a stand?" "No," Jacob admitted. "That was pure pride and too much whiskey. But what's come after?" He struggled for words. "Maybe sometimes we do the wrong thing for the wrong reasons and accidentally find something right." "Accidentally?" Clara repeated, a note of amusement creeping into her voice. "How romantic." It was the first time he'd heard her approach anything like teasing, and it sparked something warm in his chest. "I'm not known for pretty speeches," he said, "but I know what I see. You've brought something to the ranch. Clara, the garden, the way you handled that snake, the way the hands respect you already. Even Maria admitted yesterday that you've improved her pickle recipe, and she hasn't changed that in 20 years. "I added dill," Clara said, but her cheeks had pinked slightly at the praise. "Just dill." They remounted and continued their survey, the conversation flowing more easily now. Clara asked intelligent questions about ranching, water rights, cattle prices. She understood numbers, grasped the economic realities he faced with the drought. It was like talking to another rancher rather than a woman. And Jacob found himself sharing concerns he usually kept to himself. The sun was angling low when they turned back toward the ranch. As they rode, a group of riders appeared on the horizon, moving fast toward town, even at a distance. Jacob recognized the lead rider's distinctive gray horse. "Who's that?" Clara asked, noting his sudden tension. "Ned Bartlett and his crew. They have a spread about 10 miles south. Good men, mostly. But Ned's got a temper when he's drinking." The riders changed direction, angling to intercept them. Jacob's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, though he kept the gesture casual. These were technically neighbors, after all. "Well, well," Ned Bartlett called as the groups met. "Jacob Harlow and his mystery woman? Boys, take a good look. This is what $200 buys you these days." Jacob felt Clara stiffen beside him, but her face remained impassive. The other riders, 4 of them, all young and clearly deep in their cups, laughed uneasily. "Afternoon, Ned," Jacob said evenly. "You boys heading to town?" "We are indeed. Gonna spend some of our hard-earned money on women who don't hide under veils." Ned's bloodshot eyes fixed on Clara. "Though I guess you solved that mystery, didn't you, Harlow? Tell me, was she worth—" "Choose your next words very carefully," Jacob interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Very carefully." The laughter died. Ned's hand twitched toward his gun, but one of his men, an older hand named Cousins, grabbed his arm. "Boss, we should get going. Girls at the Silver Dollar are waiting." For a moment, violence hung in the air like dust before a storm. Then Ned laughed, ugly and forced. Sure. No offense meant. Harlow, just making conversation. Ma'am." He touched his hat mockingly to Clara. After they'd ridden on, Clara released a breath Jacob hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Does that happen often?" "It won't happen again," Jacob said grimly. "I'll have a word with Ned when he's sober." "Don't." Clara's voice was firm. "I've seen what happens when men defend women's honor with violence. It only makes things worse. Let them talk. Words can't hurt me anymore." But Jacob heard the lie in that. Words had driven her from Kansas, had taken her husband and son, had reduced her to standing on an auction block. Words could be as deadly as bullets in the right mouths. They rode the rest of the way in silence, each lost in thought. As the ranch buildings came into view, Clara spoke again. "Despite Mr. Bartlett, this was nice. Thank you for showing me the land." "We'll ride again," Jacob said, making it a promise. "Maybe check the eastern boundaries next time. There's a spot where you can see for 50 miles on a clear day." "I'd like that," Clara said. And this time, her smile reached her eyes. As they dismounted at the barn, Jacob watched her walk toward the house, moving with new confidence in her borrowed clothes. The encounter with Bartlett had been ugly, but not unexpected. There would be more such meetings, more crude comments and hostile stares. But Clara had faced them down with dignity, just as she'd faced that rattlesnake calm, practical, unafraid, or at least appearing unafraid, which in the West amounted to the same thing. Tom appeared from the barn, taking the horse's reins. "How was the north pasture?" "Dry as bone," Jacob replied, but his mind wasn't on water problems. He was thinking about windmills and newspapers, about a woman who could edit articles and kill snakes with equal competence, about the way the afternoon light had caught in her remaining hair and made it shine like copper. "Boss?" Tom prompted. "You all right?" "Fine," Jacob said, pulling his thoughts back to practical matters. "We'll need to move the herd tomorrow. And Tom, send someone to Cheyenne next week. I want to know more about these windmill pumps Mrs. Thornton mentioned." Tom's weathered face cracked in a knowing smile. "Yes, sir. I'll get right on that." As Jacob headed for the house, he could hear Clara and Maria in the kitchen, their voices mixing in what sounded like an animated discussion about preserving vegetables for winter. Normal, domestic sounds that somehow made the big house feel more like a home than it had in years. The drought would worsen before it improved. Ned Bartlett would cause trouble. Buck Watson would keep spreading his poison in town. But for now, in this moment, the Double H Ranch felt like a place where damaged things might grow again, where scars could be worn openly, where even the driest ground might yield to patient tending. It wasn't love. Not yet. But like Clara's garden, something was definitely beginning to take root. The news arrived on a cold November morning, carried by a rider who'd nearly killed his horse getting to the Double H. Jacob was in the barn checking on a sick calf when Tom Brennan burst in, his face grave. "Boss, you need to hear this. Charlie just rode in from town. There's been killings down near the border. A ranch family named the Carters, burned out, just like—" Tom's eyes flicked toward the house where Clara was likely working. "Just like what happened in Kansas." Jacob straightened slowly, his blood running cold. "Same men, Charlie says the survivors described 4 riders. One of them had a scar running from his ear to his jaw, spoke with a Missouri accent. Sound familiar? It did. Clara had described that scar in painful detail during one of their evening conversations. The man who'd held her back while she watched her family die. Luther Kane. She'd called him, though she doubted that was his real name. How far? 3 days' ride, maybe 4. But boss, if they're moving north. Jacob was already heading for the house, his mind racing. 3 days away could become 2, then 1. The gang had stayed quiet for over a year, long enough for people to hope they'd moved on to easier territories. But men like that didn't retire. They just found new victims. He found Clara in the kitchen, teaching Maria's niece Rosa how to properly can preserves. She looked up at his entrance, her smile fading as she read his expression. What's happened? Jacob hesitated. How did you tell someone their nightmare had returned? But Clara was no fragile flower to be protected from hard truths. There's been an attack south of here. A ranch burned, family killed. The description matches the men who... The jar Clara was holding slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. Rosa gasped, but Clara stood frozen, her face draining of color. How far? Her voice was barely a whisper. 3 days. Maybe more. Maybe less. Clara's hand went to her scarred scalp, an unconscious gesture he'd noticed she made when distressed. They're coming north, following the cattle trails, looking for isolated ranches. It's what they do. We don't know that for certain. Yes, we do. Clara's voice gained strength, along with an edge of steel. Luther Kane doesn't leave territories until he's bled them dry. There are too many profitable ranches here for him to pass up. She looked at Jacob directly, including this one. Maria had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the crash. She took one look at their faces and ushered Rosa out, muttering about checking on the washing. We need to prepare. Clara continued, moving with sudden purpose. How many hands do you have who can shoot, really shoot? Not just chase off wolves. 8, maybe 9. Tom's solid. Pete's learning. The Hendricks brothers are good with rifles. Not enough. Clara paced to the window, staring out at the peaceful ranch yard. They hit at night, usually. Set fires to create chaos. Shoot anyone who runs out. We need water barrels stationed around all the buildings, sand buckets in the lofts, and we need more men. Jacob watched her transform from quiet widow to tactical planner and felt a mix of admiration and concern. Clara, maybe you should go to town. Stay with... No. She spun to face him. I've run before. I won't run again. Besides... Her mouth twisted bitterly. Where would I go? Who in Redemption Creek would shelter the burned widow? Then we make our stand here, Jacob said. Together. Something shifted in Clara's expression. A softening that made his breath catch. Together, she repeated quietly. The next days passed in a blur of preparation. Jacob sent riders to neighboring ranches, warning them and asking for help. Some promised to come if needed. Others were too concerned with their own protection. Ned Bartlett laughed in Tom's face, saying Jacob had brought this on himself by harboring that cursed woman. Clara threw herself into the defensive preparations with grim efficiency. She organized the women, Maria, Rosa, and 2 wives of ranch hands, into a medical unit, teaching them basic wound care. She had seen too many die from treatable injuries while waiting for a doctor who came too late. She also revealed another surprise. In the evenings, she took out an old Colt .45 that had been her husband's and practiced behind the barn. Her first shots went wild. But by the 3rd evening, she was hitting more than she missed. Robert tried to teach me, she explained to Jacob as he watched her reload. I was too proud then, said ladies didn't need to shoot. After he died, I learned different, but I haven't practiced in months. You're doing fine, Jacob said, adjusting her stance slightly. Don't jerk the trigger. Squeeze it like you're pressing a flower. Clara gave him a look. Do I seem like someone who presses flowers? You grow them. Same principle. She fired again, this time hitting the bottle they'd set on a fence post. A small smile of satisfaction crossed her face. "Can I ask you something?" Jacob said as she reloaded. "That night in Kansas, you said they held you back, made you watch. How did you survive?" Clara's hand stilled on the gun. For a long moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "Luther Kane said I was too pretty to waste. He was going to, after he finished with the house, but the fire spread faster than they expected. A burning beam fell between us. By the time they got around it, half the town had arrived. They ran." She raised the gun again. "He promised he'd find me again someday. Finish what he started. He'll have to go through me first." Clara lowered the weapon, looking at him with those storm-gray eyes. "Why, Jacob? Why do you care what happens to me? I'm not the woman you thought you were buying at that auction. I'm marked, damaged, drawing danger to your door." Jacob struggled to find words for feelings he didn't fully understand himself. "Maybe because you're the first real thing I've encountered in years. No pretense, no games, just strength and survival and—" He paused, then plunged ahead. "And you make this place feel alive again. The ranch was successful before, but empty. Now it feels like somewhere worth defending." Clara studied his face, searching for something. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her. She raised the gun and fired again. Another perfect shot. On the fourth night, as they finished dinner, one of the night guards rode in hard. "Riders coming!" he shouted. "From the south!" The ranch exploded into organized chaos. Clara ran for her medical supplies while Jacob and his men took defensive positions. Women and children were moved to the stone root cellar, the safest place in case of fire. Clara refused to go, stationing herself at an upstairs window with her Colt and a rifle Jacob had given her. They waited, tense minutes stretching like hours. Then Tom's voice called out, "Stand down, it's the Hendersons." Indeed, Bill Henderson and his 3 sons rode into the yard, all armed. "Heard you might need help," Bill said simply. "My Mary's at home with the shotgun and our youngest boy. We figured you could use the extra guns." Others trickled in over the next hour. Not many, maybe 6 additional men, but more than Jacob had hoped. Even crusty Ed Paulson from the neighboring ranch showed up, grumbling about fools who couldn't handle their own troubles, but taking his position nonetheless. Clara appeared at Jacob's shoulder as he organized the defenders. "They might not come tonight, might wait, watch, look for weaknesses. Then we wait too," Jacob replied. "However long it takes." But they didn't have to wait long. Near midnight, with a crescent moon providing just enough light to see shadows, the attack began. It started with fire arrows arcing through the darkness, aimed at the hay barn. But Clara's preparation paid off. Men were ready with water buckets, dousing flames before they could spread. Then came the gunfire, muzzle flashes lighting up the night from 4 different positions. "They're trying to flank us," Tom shouted, firing at the flashes. Jacob coordinated the defense, moving men to meet each threat. The Hendersons proved their worth, picking off attackers with careful shots. But the enemy was skilled too, using cover and darkness to their advantage. Then Jacob heard it. Clara's Colt firing steadily from the upper window. He glanced up to see her silhouetted against the lamplight, calm and methodical. A scream from near the corral told him she'd found her mark. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the firing stopped. In the relative quiet, a voice called out, rough, mocking, tinged with that Missouri accent Clara had described. "Jacob Harlow, send out the woman and we'll leave peaceful like... You've got 1 minute to decide. Luther Kane. It had to be." Jacob was about to respond when Clara's voice rang out from above, clear and defiant. "Luther Kane, you murdered my family, burned my home, destroyed my life. Come and get me yourself if you're not the coward I remember." A harsh laugh answered her. Well, the pretty little newspaper wife. Looks like the fire didn't improve your looks none. From what I hear, 1 minute, Harlow." "Go to hell," Jacob roared back. "You want her. You go through all of us. So be it." The attack resumed with renewed fury. This time, Kane's men concentrated on the house itself. trying to break through the defenses. Jacob heard windows shattering, men shouting, the continuous bark of gunfire. Then Clara screamed. Without thought, Jacob abandoned his position and raced for the house. He found her struggling with a man who'd climbed through the window, not Kane, but one of his men. Clara's gun was empty. Knocked aside. The attacker had her pinned. One hand raised to strike. Jacob's rifle butt caught the man in the temple, dropping him instantly. Clara scrambled back, breathing hard, her neat bun now disheveled and wild. "Behind you!" she gasped. Jacob spun, firing instinctively. Another attacker tumbled back through the window. Outside, the gunfire was becoming sporadic. He heard Tom yelling orders, someone calling for medical help. "Are you hurt?" Jacob asked, helping Clara to her feet. "No, I'm—" Her eyes widened. "Jacob, you're bleeding!" He looked down, surprised to see blood spreading across his shirt. Adrenaline had masked the pain, but now it hit like a hammer. He'd been shot, probably when he'd turned to fire. The room spun slightly. "It's not bad," he lied, even as his knees buckled. Clara caught him, surprisingly strong for her size. "Don't you dare," she said fiercely. "Don't you dare die on me, Jacob Harlow. Not now." The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Clara's face, her scars prominent in the lamplight, tears tracking down her cheeks as she pressed her hands against his wound and shouted for help. Clara rode hard through the pre-dawn darkness, her borrowed hat pulled low against the bitter wind. Behind her, the Double H Ranch grew smaller with each thundering hoofbeat. She'd left while Jacob slept fitfully, his wound tended but fever setting in. Maria would care for him. Tom would protect the ranch. But Clara had her own reckoning to face. The attack had failed. Luther Kane and 2 of his men had escaped into the night, leaving 2 dead companions behind. The defenders had held, but at a cost. Jacob's wound, while not fatal if properly tended, had shaken something loose in Clara, watching his blood seep through her fingers, hearing his labored breathing. She'd made a decision. No more running, no more hiding, no more letting others pay for her survival. She knew where Kane would go. In her months of widowhood, she'd tracked his movements obsessively, gathering information from travelers and newspapers. There was an abandoned mining camp in the hills, 20 miles north, the perfect hideout for men needing to lay low. Kane was predictable in his cruelty, but also in his habits. The landscape changed as she climbed into the foothills, scrub brush giving way to scattered pines and exposed rock. The mare Jacob had given her, steady, sure-footed buttermilk, navigated the rough terrain without complaint. Clara had taken provisions, weapons, and something else. The journal she'd kept since Robert's death, filled with every scrap of information about Kane and his gang. She also carried Jacob's words in her heart. "You're the first real thing I've encountered in years." The sun was rising when she reached Skeleton Ridge, overlooking the abandoned camp. Wood smoke drifted up from what had once been the main shaft building. Clara counted horses, 3, including Kane's distinctive Pinto. Good. They were all here. Clara tied Buttermilk in a grove of pines, checked her weapons, the Colt, a rifle, and a knife she'd taken from the kitchen. Not much against 3 hardened killers, but she had something they didn't. Nothing left to lose. Or so she'd thought. Before Jacob. Now. She pushed the thought away. If she started thinking about what waited for her back at the ranch, about the life she was just beginning to imagine, she'd lose her nerve. Moving carefully, using skills learned from a Pawnee woman who'd worked at a neighboring farm in Kansas. Clara crept closer to the camp. The men were arguing. She could hear their raised voices carrying on the mountain air. "Should have never gone after that ranch," one said. "Harlow had too many men." "Shut your mouth, Collins." Kane's voice, rough with anger and exhaustion. "We'll hit them again when they're not expecting it." "With what men? Baxter and Slim are dead. Then we'll get more men. Always plenty of desperate souls willing to join up for easy money." Clara positioned herself behind a cluster of rocks, checking sight lines. The smart thing would be to wait, pick them off one by one as they separated. But smart hadn't saved Robert or Timothy. Smart hadn't stopped her nightmares. She stood up, rifle aimed at the doorway. "Luther Kane, face me like a man!" The arguing stopped. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Kane emerged, his hand near his gun but not drawing. The scar she remembered was more prominent in daylight, an ugly rope of tissue that pulled his mouth into a permanent sneer. Well, the burned widow comes calling. His eyes traveled over her, taking in the men's clothing, the steady rifle. "Harlow send you? Or are you here on your own account?" "My own, always my own." "Where's your man? Heard he took a bullet for you." Kane smiled, cruel and knowing. "They always do, don't they? Your husband, now Harlow, you're like a curse. Woman, everything you touch burns." The words hit their mark, but Clara kept her rifle steady. "The only curse here is you. You killed my family, destroyed my home. It ends today." Kane laughed. "You think you can take all three of us? Collins, Murphy, we got company!" The other two men emerged, spreading out slowly. Clara's military assessment noted their positions, the careful way they moved. These weren't common thugs. They were experienced killers. "Seems a shame." Kane continued conversationally, his hand still hovering near his gun. "You could have had a nice life with that rancher. Heard he's sweet on you, despite—" He gestured at her head. "Well, despite everything. But you had to come looking for blood. You came to the ranch first." Clara reminded him. "Business, nothing personal. Railroad pays good money to clear out certain obstacles. Your husband was one. These ranchers holding prime land are others." Kane's smile widened. "Though I'll admit, finishing what I started with you would have been a pleasure." Clara saw Murphy's hand twitch and reacted instinctively. Her rifle cracked, catching Murphy in the shoulder, spinning him around. Then everything happened at once. Kane drew with a lightning speed, but Clara was already moving, diving behind the rocks as bullets whined overhead. Collins fired from her left, forcing her to scramble for better cover. Her rifle was empty. No time to reload. She pulled the Colt, Robert's Colt, the weight familiar in her hand. Murphy was down but not out, firing with his good arm. A bullet tugged at Clara's sleeve. Another struck sparks from the rocks inches from her face. She fired back, forcing Collins to duck. Then Kane was moving, circling to flank her. Clara realized with cold clarity that she'd walked into a trap of her own making. 3 against 1, even with Murphy wounded, was impossible odds. Jacob's face flashed through her mind, not his handsome features, but the way he'd looked at her that night in his room, seeing past the scars to the woman beneath. She'd found something worth living for, only to throw it away on revenge. No, not revenge. Justice. Clara burst from cover, firing as she ran. Collins cursed, clutching his leg. Kane's shot took her hat off. So close she felt the heat. She dove, rolled, came up firing. The Colt clicked empty. Kane stood 10 feet away, his gun trained on her. "Just like in Kansas," he said. "Except no burning beam to save you this time." Clara stared down the barrel of his gun, waiting for the end. Instead, she heard hoofbeats, lots of them. Kane's eyes widened. He spun toward the sound, and Clara didn't waste the opportunity. She launched herself at him, the kitchen knife somehow in her hand. They went down together, rolling in the dirt. Kane was stronger, but Clara had desperation and fury. The knife found its mark, sliding between his ribs. Kane's eyes widened in shock, then fury, then nothing. Clara rolled away, gasping. As riders thundered into the camp, Tom Brennan led them, with Pete and the Hendricks brothers. And there, pale but upright in his saddle, was Jacob. "Clara!" He was off his horse before it fully stopped, catching her as her knees buckled. "You damn fool woman! You beautiful, brave, damn fool! You're supposed to be in bed," she managed. "The fever broke about an hour after you left. Maria told me you'd taken buttermilk and provisions." His hands framed her face, thumbs gentle on her cheeks. "Did you think I'd let you face them alone? I couldn't let anyone else die for me." Nobody's dying for anybody. Tom interrupted. Surveying the scene, Murphy and Collins were both down, neither fatally. Kane lay still, Clara's knife protruding from his chest. Though it looks like you did a fair job on your own. It's over, Clara said wonderingly. He's really dead. It's over, Jacob confirmed, pulling her against him. She could feel his heart racing, matching her own. Come home, Clara, come home. Home. The word broke in something inside her. She'd had a home once, lost it to violence and greed, but maybe, just maybe, she could have one again. The ride back was a blur. Jacob insisted she ride with him, leaving buttermilk to Tom. Clara didn't protest, too exhausted to maintain her usual independence. She dozed against Jacob's chest, waking only when they created the final rise before the ranch. The Double H spread out before them in the afternoon sun. Maria stood on the porch, Rosa beside her. Some of the ranch hands' families had gathered, word having spread. As they rode in, Clara expected judgment, fear, rejection. Instead, Maria rushed forward as Jacob helped her dismount. Senora Clara, you are hurt. No, Clara swayed, and Maria caught her other arm. She's exhausted, Jacob said, and in shock, Luther Kane is dead. Maria crossed herself. Good, that one. He had the devil in him. Come, Senora, bath and bed for you. But Clara pulled free, standing on her own despite her shaking legs. The gathered people were staring at her torn clothes, the blood on her hands, the wild tangle of her scarred head where the hat had been shot off. I brought violence to this place, she said, her voice carrying clearly. My past, my troubles. You had every right to turn me away, but you didn't. You stood with us, fought with us. Thank you. Old Ed Paulson spat tobacco juice. Hell, woman. We've been fighting off one thing or another since we got here. Drought, Indians, rustlers, now outlaws. At least this time we had warning. He looked at Jacob. Your woman's got sand. Harlow, hang on to her. Planning on it, Jacob said quietly. The crowd dispersed, people returning to their homes and work. Life on the frontier didn't pause long, even for high drama. Maria finally succeeded in ushering Clara inside, muttering about hot water and clean bandages. An hour later, bathed and wearing a clean nightgown, Clara sat in the kitchen while Maria tended various scrapes and cuts she hadn't even noticed acquiring. Jacob sat across from her, his own wound freshly bandaged, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Say it, Clara finally demanded. Whatever lecture you're planning, just say it. No lecture. Jacob reached across the table, taking her hand. Just a question. Why did you really go after them? Clara considered lying, but she was too tired for pretense. Because I couldn't bear the thought of losing you, of watching another good man die because of me. I thought if I faced them alone, at least the only life at risk would be mine. And you didn't think I'd feel the same, that losing you would be any easier for me? The simple honesty of the question undid her. Tears she'd held back for 14 months finally came, great gasping sobs that shook her whole body. Jacob was around the table in an instant, gathering her against him. I'm sorry, she gasped. I'm so sorry. For the auction, for the danger, for everything. Hush. Jacob's voice was rough with his own emotion. You saved my life during that attack. You faced down your demons and won. You've got nothing to apologize for. Maria quietly left the room, giving them privacy. Clara cried until she had nothing left. Years of grief and fear and rage finally finding release. Through it all, Jacob held her, solid and steady as the mountains. When she finally quieted, he spoke again. I know we started wrong. The auction, the bet, all of it. But somewhere along the way, it became right. You became right. Essential. Like water in this drought. The thing that keeps everything else alive. Clara pulled back to look at him. His gray eyes were serious. Sincere. Jacob, I'm not good with pretty words. Clara, but I know what I want. I want you to stay. Not because I bought your contract. Not because you've got nowhere else to go. But because this place isn't home without you, I'm not home without you. I'm still scarred, she said softly. Still broken in places that might never heal. We're all scarred. Some just show more than others. He touched her face gently, tracing the line where burn scars met unmarked skin. You're beautiful, Clara Thornton. Beautiful and brave and too stubborn for your own good. Stay. Help me build something here. Something worth having. Clara thought of Kansas, of all she'd lost. Then she thought of the garden growing behind this kitchen, of Maria's acceptance, of the ranch hands who'd risked their lives to defend her, of this man who'd ridden after her with a bullet wound barely closed, who saw her truly and wanted her anyway. All right, she whispered. I'll stay. Jacob's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. He kissed her then, gentle and promising. And Clara felt something she'd thought dead forever spark back to life. Not just desire, though that was there. Hope, the most dangerous emotion of all. And the most necessary, outside. Storm clouds were building on the horizon. The drought would break soon, bringing the rain the land desperately needed. But inside the kitchen of the Double H Ranch, two wounded souls had already found their salvation in each other. Luther Kane was dead. The past was buried. And tomorrow, Clara thought as Jacob held her close, tomorrow they could finally start building a future worth having. The storm that had been building on the horizon finally broke 3 days after Clara's confrontation with Kane. Thunder rolled across the plains like artillery fire, and rain fell in sheets that turned the dusty ground to mud within minutes. But this wasn't the gentle salvation the drought-stricken land needed. This was nature's fury unleashed. Clara stood at the window of Jacob's study, watching lightning illuminate the ranch in stark, white flashes. Behind her, Jacob worked at his desk, tallying losses from the drought and the recent attack. They'd developed an easy rhythm in the days since Kane's death, comfortable silences, shared meals, the gradual weaving together of two lives. The creek will flood, she observed, noting how the water ran in torrents where it hadn't flowed for months. We should move the cattle from the lower pasture. Jacob looked up, appreciating, as always, her practical mind. Already sent Tom and the boys to handle it. They're bringing the herd to higher ground. Another crack of thunder shook the house. In the distance, Clara could see lanterns bobbing as the ranch hands worked to secure everything that might wash away. Then, cutting through the storm's noise, came a sound that made her blood freeze. Gunfire. That came from town, Jacob said, already reaching for his rifle. More shots, rapid and desperate. Clara grabbed her own weapon. She'd taken to keeping it close since the attack. Something's wrong. That's not celebration shooting. Pete Morrison burst through the door, soaked and wild-eyed. Boss, riders coming from town. They say Kane's gang. What's left of them? They're attacking. Taking revenge for Luther. Clara's heart sank. She'd killed Kane, but forgotten about the other members of his gang who hadn't been at the mining camp. Of course they'd want blood for blood. How many? Jacob demanded, already moving. 8, maybe 10. They hit the bank first, then the saloon. Sheriff's dead. They're shooting anyone who gets in their way. Pete's voice cracked. They're saying they want the woman who killed their leader. Get every man armed, Jacob ordered. Set up defensive positions. They want to bring the fight here. We'll be ready. But Clara was already heading for the door. No more people dying because of me. I'll go to town. Face them there. Jacob caught her arm. Like hell you will. We've been through this. Clara, we stand together. The town doesn't deserve this. She pulled free, anguish in her voice. Those are innocent people dying. The banker's wife, the school teacher, people who never hurt anyone. I can't have more blood on my hands. It's not your blood to carry, Jacob said firmly. You defended yourself against a murderer. These men choosing violence, that's on them, not you. Through the rain came more sounds. Horses, shouting, the distant glow of fire. The gang wasn't coming to the ranch. They were destroying the town, trying to draw Clara out. Then we go to them. Clara decided, all of us. The town helped defend the ranch. Now we return the favor. Jacob studied her face, then nodded. "Tom, gather the men. We ride for town." Within minutes, they were mounted and riding through the storm. Clara had never seen rain like this. It turned the familiar road into a river of mud, made visibility nearly impossible. Lightning provided snapshot illuminations of the hellish scene ahead. Redemption Creek was burning. Despite the rain, several buildings were ablaze. The attackers had used coal oil, ensuring the fires would resist nature's attempt to douse them. Bodies lay in the street. Townspeople huddled in doorways, afraid to flee or fight. "There!" Tom pointed to the saloon, where muzzle flashes indicated an active gunfight. They split up, Jacob leading half the men toward the saloon while Clara took others to flank from behind. She splashed through the muddy streets, Robert's Colt steady in her hand despite the rain streaming down her face. A figure lurched from an alley, one of Kane's men. She recognized him from wanted posters. He saw her, raised his gun, but Clara was faster. The Colt barked once, and he fell face first into the mud. "That's one," she muttered, pushing forward. The scene at the saloon was chaos. Several townsmen had barricaded themselves inside, trading shots with gang members who'd taken cover behind water troughs and wagons. Clara could see Buck Watson among the defenders. Even that fool had found courage when his town was threatened. "Murphy!" a voice called out. One of the gang members, a thin man with cruel eyes. "I got her! The burned woman's here!" Clara dove as bullets split the air where she'd stood. She rolled, came up firing, drove the man back into cover. But now they knew she was here, the primary target. "Clara Thornton," a new voice, commanding and cold. The gang's new leader. She guessed. "You killed Luther Kane. Now we burn your new town like you burned in Kansas." "I didn't burn in Kansas," Clara shouted back, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I survived, just like this town will survive you." She moved position quickly, knowing they'd target her voice. Good. Let them focus on her while Jacob and the others got into position. The battle raged through the streets. Rain and gun smoke created a hellish fog. Lit by lightning and muzzle flashes, Clara lost track of how many shots she fired, how many times she narrowly avoided death. Her world narrowed to survival. Move, shoot, reload, repeat. Then she saw her chance. 3 gang members had holed up in the livery stable, using it as a stronghold to pin down the defenders. But Clara knew that stable. She'd helped birth a foal there just last week. There was a weak board in the back wall. Moving carefully, she circled around. The board gave way under pressure, and she slipped inside. The 3 men were focused on the front entrance, firing steadily at anything that moved. Clara had a clear shot at all 3. For a moment, she hesitated. These men were killers. Yes, but shooting them in the back. One of them laughed, ugly and harsh. "Did you see that woman's face when I shot her husband? Priceless!" Clara's hesitation vanished. She fired 3 times, quick and precise. 2 men fell immediately. The third spun, wounded, trying to bring his gun around. Jacob appeared in the doorway, finishing what Clara had started. "Behind you!" Jacob shouted. Clara turned to see another gang member who'd followed her through the loose board. His gun was rising, finger on the trigger. Time slowed. She knew with cold certainty that she couldn't move fast enough. The shot was impossibly loud in the confined space. Clara waited for the impact, the pain. Instead, the man toppled forward. Behind him stood Sarah Mills, the widow from the auction, holding a smoking shotgun with shaking hands. "You stood up for us at the ranch," Sarah said simply, returning the favor. The battle was turning. Townspeople, emboldened by the arrival of the ranch fighters, joined the fray. The remaining gang members, realizing they'd lost the advantage of surprise in numbers, tried to flee. "Don't let them escape," someone shouted. "They'll just come back." It was Pete who ended it. The young ranch hand, barely 20, stood in the middle of Main Street as the last 3 gang members tried to ride out. His rifle cracked 3 times, 3 saddles emptied. Silence fell, broken only by the rain and the moaning of wounded. Clara stood in the stable doorway, suddenly aware of a dozen small injuries, cuts, bruises, a graze on her shoulder that was bleeding steadily. "Clara!" Jacob was beside her, hands checking for serious wounds. "Are you hit?" "I'm fine." She wasn't. Not really. But she was alive. They were alive? The town? "We lost some good people," Jacob said grimly. "But it could have been worse. Would have been, if we hadn't come." They emerged into the street to find townspeople already organizing bucket brigades for the fires, tending wounded, covering the dead. Judge Morrison, who'd hidden in his root cellar during the fight, appeared to take charge with bureaucratic efficiency. Mrs. Thornton, Ezra Blackwood, the merchant who'd bid against Jacob at the auction, approached hesitantly. "I owe you an apology, and my thanks. You and Mr. Harlow saved us tonight." Clara didn't know how to respond to that. She was saved from trying by Maria, who appeared with medical supplies, clucking over Clara's injuries like a mother hen. "Always fighting," Maria scolded, cleaning the shoulder wound. "First snakes, now banditos. What next?" "Hopefully nothing," Clara said wearily. "I think I've had enough fighting for one lifetime." Dawn was breaking by the time they returned to the ranch. The storm had passed, leaving clear skies and the sweet smell of rain-washed earth. Clara stood on the porch, watching the sun paint the wet landscape in shades of gold and green. "It's over," Jacob said, joining her. "Kane's dead. His gang's finished. You can stop looking over your shoulder now." Clara leaned into his solid warmth. "I don't know how to do that. I've been running or fighting for so long. Then maybe it's time to try something else. Living, for instance." "Living," Clara repeated, testing the word. "With you? If you'll have me, scars and stubbornness and all." Clara turned to face him fully. In the morning light, she could see the exhaustion in his face, the blood on his clothes, the way he favored his wounded side, but also the steadiness in his eyes, the gentle strength that had drawn her from the beginning. "The townspeople," she said slowly. "They fought for me. Sarah Mills saved my life. After everything, after all the whispers and stares, you earned their respect," Jacob said simply. "By standing for them when it mattered. That's how it works out here. Actions matter more than appearances." "Then I better make sure my actions are worth respecting." Clara took a deep breath. "Yes, Jacob Harlow. I'll have you, scars and stubbornness and all." He kissed her as the sun climbed higher, bathing the rain-refreshed ranch in light. Around them, life continued. Maria hanging laundry, Tom directing repairs, the normal rhythm of a working ranch resuming. But for Clara and Jacob, standing together on the porch of what was now truly their home, a new chapter was beginning. The drought had broken. The demons of the past lay dead in muddy streets. And love, stubborn and unlikely as prairie grass, had taken root in ground that had seemed too damaged to support new growth. "What comes next?" Clara asked, watching an eagle circle overhead. "Whatever it is," Jacob said, his arms secure around her. "We'll face it together." Together. The word that had once seemed impossible now felt like a promise. Clara thought of Robert and Timothy, always in her heart, but no longer chains binding her to grief. They would want this for her, this second chance, this unexpected happiness. The eagle cried once and soared higher, riding currents only it could feel. Below, the Double H Ranch steamed gently in the morning sun, washed clean and ready for whatever came next. Clara was ready too. Spring came to Wyoming with a vengeance that year, as if nature itself was celebrating the end of drought and violence. The prairie bloomed with wildflowers Clara had never seen before: Indian paintbrush, prairie roses, and blankets of yellow that stretched to the horizon. The Double H Ranch thrived under the gentle rains and warming sun. And with it, so did the relationship between its master and the woman who'd transformed it into a true home. Clara stood in her expanded garden, now 3 times its original size, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. The tomatoes were coming in strong. Beans climbed their poles with enthusiasm, and her experimental patch of herbs filled the air with fragrance. But it was the roses that drew her attention, red climbers that she'd coaxed to grow along the fence. defying everyone who said roses couldn't survive Wyoming winters. "You've worked a miracle here," Jacob said, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. It had become their evening ritual, watching the sunset together, discussing the day's work and tomorrow's plans. "Plants are forgiving," Clara replied, accepting the cup gratefully. "Give them what they need, and they'll bloom despite the harshest conditions." Speaking of blooming, Jacob set down his cup and took her hands. "Clara, we need to talk about something." She studied his face, noting the nervousness that sat oddly on a man who'd faced down outlaws without flinching. "What is it?" "Judge Morrison stopped by today. Pointed out that your widow's contract from the auction expires next week. Legally, you're free to leave. Go anywhere you want." He paused, struggling with words. "But before you make any decisions, I have something to ask." Clara's heart began to race as Jacob dropped to one knee right there in the garden, producing a small velvet box from his pocket. "Clara Thornton, you came into my life through circumstances neither of us would have chosen. But somewhere between that awful auction and now, you became everything. My partner, my conscience, my reason for building something beyond just land and cattle." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold ring with a small sapphire. "I'm asking you to stay, not as a contracted widow, but as my wife, real and true, before God and the law. Will you marry me?" Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, not the bitter tears of grief she'd grown accustomed to, but something sweeter. "Jacob Harlow, are you sure? The town might accept me now, but as your wife, the scarred woman will always be—" "The bravest woman I know," Jacob interrupted firmly. "The woman who saved my ranch, my life, and my soul. The woman I love, scars and all." "Then yes," Clara whispered. Then louder, "Yes, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and kissed her as the ranch hands, who'd apparently been watching from various vantage points, burst into cheers. Maria appeared on the porch, wiping her eyes and shouting something in Spanish that sounded like a blessing. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in Redemption Creek's small church. The building was packed, not because of morbid curiosity as Clara had feared, but with genuine well-wishers. The battle against Kane's gang had bonded the ranch and town in ways neither community had expected. Clara wore a dress of pale blue that Maria and Rosa had sewn, her head covered not with veils of mourning, but with a delicate lace veil that let light through. She'd worried about her appearance, but Maria had worked magic with the patches of hair that remained, weaving them with silk flowers into something beautiful. "You ready for this?" Tom Brennan asked, in a gesture that had touched Clara deeply. The foreman had offered to give her away. "I've been ready since the day I stopped running," Clara replied, taking his arm. The church doors opened, and Clara saw Jacob waiting at the altar, handsome in his best suit but looking slightly uncomfortable with the formality. His face when he saw her, though the wonder and love there made everything else fade away. Reverend Douglas performed the ceremony with appropriate solemnity, though his eyes twinkled when he reached the part about "for better or worse." "Seems like you two have already tested that part pretty thoroughly," he observed, earning chuckles from the congregation. When Jacob kissed his bride, the cheer that went up could probably be heard in the next county. Even Buck Watson, somewhat chastened by recent events, was seen to smile and applaud. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up under the cottonwoods that were just leafing out. The entire town seemed to have come, bringing food and gifts. Clara was especially touched when Sarah Mills presented her with a quilt. Each woman in town contributed a square. Sarah explained, "To thank you for standing up for us and to welcome you properly to Redemption Creek." Clara traced the different patterns, each square unique, some clearly made by experienced hands, others charmingly crooked. "It's beautiful. Thank you, all of you." As the evening wore on and the dancing began, Clara found herself momentarily alone, watching the celebration from the porch. The Clara of 2 years ago could never have imagined this. Happiness after such loss, acceptance after such scarring, love after such violence. "No regrets?" Jacob asked, joining her. "No regrets." she confirmed. Robert would have wanted this for me, to find peace, to find purpose again. She looked up at her new husband. To find you. Think we'll have a quiet life from here on out? Jacob asked with a grin. Clara laughed, the sound carrying across the ranch. On a cattle ranch in Wyoming? During calving season, with droughts and storms and whatever else this land throws at us? I doubt it. Good, Jacob said, pulling her close. I'd hate to get bored. Pete Morrison appeared, fiddle in hand. Mrs. Harlow, time for you and the boss to lead a dance. Mrs. Harlow. The name sat strangely on Clara's shoulders, but not unpleasantly. She'd been Mrs. Thornton for so long, defined by her first marriage and its tragic end. Now she had a chance to define herself anew. They danced under the stars, surrounded by friends and neighbors, on land that had been tested by drought and violence, but had survived, like Clara herself, like their love. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Judge Morrison approached. Mrs. Harlow, Mr. Harlow, I wanted to say something. That auction, it was a shameful practice. I've decided to end it. From now on, widows and women in need will be helped by a community fund, not sold like cattle. That's good to hear, Judge. Clara said quietly. No woman should have to stand on that platform. No, the judge agreed, looking ashamed. They shouldn't. You've taught us all something about dignity, ma'am, and about courage. After the last guest departed and the ranch settled into nighttime quiet, Clara and Jacob sat on their porch, her garden spread before them in the moonlight. The roses she'd planted were beginning to bud, promising blooms that would climb and spread, creating beauty from bare fence. Happy? Jacob asked. Happy, Clara confirmed. And grateful, for second chances, for stubborn ranchers who make foolish bets, for towns that learn to see past scars, for widows who know how to kill snakes and grow roses, Jacob added, for love that blooms in the most unlikely ground. Clara finished. Above them, the Wyoming stars wheeled in their eternal patterns, unconcerned with human struggles and joys. But below, on the Double H Ranch, two souls who'd found each other against all odds held tight to their unexpected happiness. The drought had broken, the violence had ended, and in a garden where nothing had grown for years, roses climbed toward the stars, proof that with courage, determination, and love, even the most damaged ground could bloom again. Clara Harlow, once Thornton, survivor of fire and loss, closed her eyes and listened to the night sounds of her new life. Cattle lowing in the distance, wind through the cottonwoods, her husband's steady breathing beside her, the sounds of home, the sounds of peace. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, it always did on the frontier. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, with the man who'd seen past her scars to the woman beneath, who'd stood beside her against outlaws and drought alike. I love you, Jacob Harlow, she said into the darkness. And I love you, Clara Harlow, he replied, scars and roses and all. The moon rose higher, bathing the ranch in silver light. And in the garden, the first rosebud began to open, releasing its perfume into the Wyoming night, a promise of beauty to come, of life renewed, of love that had found a way to bloom despite everything. The end had become a beginning, and Clara couldn't wait to see what grew next. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Clara and Jacob's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine. Where are you listening to this story from? Please share in the comments below. I'd love to connect with listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales of courage, love, and redemption from the American frontier. What did you think of Clara's transformation from tragedy to triumph? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one.